Welcome to Mr. Sleepless Horror. Let's go with the story. I still remember the way the air smelled that morning in northern Arizona, dry and metallic, like the forest was holding its breath. I had camped alone many times before, but something about that trip sits in my mind differently, like a bruise that never fully fades. It started with a feeling I couldn't explain, something subtle at first, like a vague pressure behind my ribs. I kept telling myself it was just the altitude or the silence, but the more I try to revisit that memory, the more I'm convinced my body noticed something long before my mind did. The campsite was nothing special, just a small clearing off an old service road near a fire lookout tower that hadn't been staffed in years. The trees were tall and closely spaced, the kind that filtered sunlight into thin, trembling beams. I had gone there to disconnect for a few days, trying to shake off the stress piling up back home. My plan was simple: hike, sleep, breathe, repeat. Nothing extraordinary, but something strange happened within hours of arriving, long before the sun went down. While collecting firewood, I kept hearing this soft, rhythmic thud coming from deeper in the trees. It didn't sound like an animal or another person. It was too steady, too intentional. I stood still for a long moment, listening. Thud, then a pause. Thud, then another pause. Like someone dropping something heavy onto the forest floor every 10 seconds. I called out, not using any names, just projecting my voice to make sure it wasn't a hiker or hunter. No response. The sound stopped immediately after I yelled. At the time, I convinced myself it was just a branch falling, or maybe a deer kicking at the ground, but the pattern felt deliberate. I should have paid more attention to that. Later that afternoon, I hiked a short trail that looped around the ridge. It wasn't far from camp, just enough to tire myself out for the night. The woods felt normal at first, quiet but not unnerving. Then I noticed footprints along the trail that didn't match my own. They were deep, heavy, and spaced wider than a casual walking stride. The ground was dry, but whoever made them pressed with enough force to leave clear outlines. I followed them for maybe 20 minutes before they abruptly veered off into the brush, straight toward the direction of my campsite. I stopped walking. Something inside me dropped, like the floor of my stomach gave way. I considered turning around immediately, but I couldn't shake the thought that maybe I was being paranoid. People wandered off trails all the time. Maybe it was just another camper looking for a good spot. Maybe I was overthinking everything. I kept walking the loop, but found myself checking over my shoulder every few steps. I didn't see anyone. Not once. Still, that lingering sense of being watched climbed up my spine and stayed there. When I returned to camp, nothing seemed out of place at first. My tent was untouched, my gear where I left it, but the firewood I had stacked earlier had been moved. Not scattered or stolen, just rearranged, as if someone had picked up each piece, studied it, and set it back down in a slightly different position. Too deliberate to be an animal. Too subtle to be an accident. I remember standing there in the fading daylight, wondering if I had done it myself and just forgotten. But I knew I hadn't. There was a wrongness to it, something that sent a prickling sensation across my skin. Night fell faster than I expected. The trees blocked most of the remaining light, and the temperature dropped sharply. I ate a quick meal, sat by the fire, and tried to ease the knot in my chest. The forest was quiet. No birds, no insects, just the occasional rustle of leaves. The kind of silence that felt heavy, like a blanket held too tightly over my face. I kept listening for that thudding sound from earlier, but nothing came. It was almost worse, the way the forest seemed to hold itself still around me. Around midnight, I crawled into my tent and tried to sleep. But the moment I closed my eyes, I sensed movement outside. Not footsteps, not breathing, just movement. A shift in air pressure, maybe, or the faint vibration of weight settling into the ground. It was slow, cautious, almost hesitant. I held my breath for what felt like minutes. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. I woke to something touching the side of my tent. Not brushing, not bumping, pressing. A firm, deliberate push right near my head. Enough to deform the fabric inward. I froze completely. My heart hammered so loudly I was convinced whoever, or whatever, was outside could hear it. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The pressure lingered for a few seconds, then slid downward, as if a hand or shoulder was dragging along the tent wall. I wanted to call out, but every instinct screamed at me to stay silent. The pressure stopped at the base of the tent. I heard a soft exhale, not quite human, but not fully animal either. Something between fatigue and irritation, like whoever was out there was frustrated that I wasn't responding. I waited for footsteps, but none came. Just silence. A dense, suffocating silence that made my ears ring. After nearly an hour of stillness, I finally built the courage to unzip the tent just enough to peek outside. My fire had burned down to a soft glow, barely illuminating the clearing. Nothing moved, but then I noticed the ground. There were fresh footprints circling my tent. One full rotation, then another. Deep impressions, heavier than the ones I saw on the trail. Whoever made them had walked around my sleeping area at least twice, close enough to reach out and touch the fabric. Close enough to press into it. I didn't sleep again. I didn't pack up. I just sat inside the tent until dawn, listening to every tiny sound. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside and studied the tracks. They led toward the trees, the same direction the earlier ones had come from. But there was something else, something far worse. A single piece of firewood had been placed directly in front of my tent door. Not thrown, not dropped, placed, like an offering, or a warning. I packed everything and left within minutes, barely looking back. But the moment that still haunts me is the final thing I saw before disappearing down the service road. A fresh footprint beside where my tent had been, and this one was deeper than all the others, as if someone had stood there watching me leave, pressing their weight into the earth to make sure I wouldn't forget. I never went camping alone again, and sometimes late at night, I swear I still feel that slow, deliberate pressure on my skin, like something reminding me it knows exactly where I sleep. The night that still wakes me from sleep began with nothing more dramatic than a stretch of empty road and a sky so clear it felt brittle. I had driven up into the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania for a quiet weekend, trying to escape the endless noise of life back home. I chose a small, primitive campsite far from the maintained loops, the kind marked only by an old metal ring and a patch of flattened earth. It was the kind of place you pick when you want absolute solitude. I didn't understand then that solitude can feel very different when something else is sharing it. The first strange moment happened right as I stepped out of my truck. The forest felt dense, not in the physical sense, but in the way air feels before a thunderstorm. Heavy, expectant. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was the long drive messing with my senses. I set up the tent, laid out my gear, and got a small fire going. The woods around me were quiet, more than quiet, hushed. Even the usual late-day birds were silent. No rustling, no insects, no wind shifting through the leaves. Just the crackle of the fire and the faint hum in my ears that always appears when the world is too still. As sunset bled into the trees, I decided to take a short walk to a nearby overlook I had seen on the map. It wasn't far from camp, maybe a 10-minute hike. The path was narrow, lined with ferns, and the air grew cooler as the darkness deepened. The forest felt tighter with every step. I couldn't explain it, but the deeper I went, the more I felt as though I was intruding somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. I reached the overlook just as the last smear of orange light slipped beyond the hills. The valley below was quiet and shadowed, a rolling sea of treetops. For a moment, the world felt vast and peaceful. I breathed in, and when I exhaled, a faint sound drifted through the trees behind me. A soft clicking, too steady to be branches, too unnatural to be any animal I knew. 3 clicks. A pause, then 3 more. I turned slowly, scanning the trail. The trees stood perfectly still, dark trunks stacked like pillars, but nothing moved. The clicking stopped as soon as I faced the forest. I waited, heart pounding in my throat. After a long stretch of silence, I convinced myself it was just a beetle or something hidden in the undergrowth. I made my way back to camp, but I didn't shake the feeling of being observed. By the time I returned, the fire had burned low. The woods were darker than I'd ever seen them, like the night had mass and texture. When I knelt to add more wood to the fire, I noticed something odd in the dirt near my tent. A small indentation, then another, then several more. They weren't footprints, not exactly. More like small, precise holes pressed into the soil in a pattern that curved around the back of the tent. Each one was perfectly round, like something narrow and cylindrical had been driven into the ground. I stared at them longer than I'd like to admit, trying to understand what could have made them. They weren't spaced like walking strides. They were too close, too methodical. I brushed it off eventually, though uneasily, and tried to settle in for the night. Inside the tent, the world felt muffled. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the fire crackling outside, trying to relax. It took a long time for sleep to come. When it finally did, It was shallow and uneasy. I woke to the sound of something tapping against the metal fire ring. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, rhythmic taps, like metal being struck lightly with a small stone or tool. My eyes snapped open, breath caught in my chest. I didn't move, didn't even shift my weight. I just listened. Tap, tap, pause, tap. There was nothing haphazard about it. It was controlled, deliberate. A pattern, almost like someone was testing how the metal sounded. I knew I should call out, make noise, do something to scare off whoever was out there. But I couldn't. My fear pinned me still, heavy and cold. The tapping stopped, and a few seconds later, something scraped against the dirt near my tent. Not footsteps. More like something being dragged slowly, carefully. A subtle hiss of earth being displaced. I forced myself to look at the tent wall, where faint shadows flickered from the dying fire outside. I could see the movement through the fabric. Something, not someone, was passing by the front of the tent, too low to be a standing person. Its outline was long, slender, and it paused directly at the entrance. I stopped breathing. The fabric of the tent indented slightly, like a single finger pressing inward, dragging lightly down the zipper seam. Not enough pressure to open it, just enough to let me know it was aware of where I was. After that, the sound stopped completely. The forest returned to that oppressive silence, and for hours I lay awake, terrified to even shift my weight. Just before dawn, exhaustion won. I drifted into a thin, fragile sleep, waking again as light finally crept into the tent. When I stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was the fire ring. Someone had placed a line of small stones along its edge. Not random stones. Smooth, rounded ones from the creek bed 50 yards away. They were arranged in an arc, each stone perfectly spaced, forming a shape that seemed meaningless at first. But when I stepped back, I realized it outlined the exact footprint of my tent. Every placement mirrored where the tent poles met the ground. It was a map, a diagram, a careful study of my sleeping space. And the strange holes I had noticed the night before now continued farther, tracing a path around the campsite, curving toward the treeline. Something had moved around me in the dark, circling, pausing, circling again. I didn't pack in neat order. I threw everything into the truck in minutes. My hands shook so badly I dropped my keys twice. I didn't look into the forest, didn't try to understand what had been out there. I just drove, but I couldn't help looking in the rearview mirror as I pulled away. Standing among the trees was a tall, narrow silhouette, not fully visible, not well-defined, just the outline of something watching me leave, unmoving, like it had been waiting all night for me to step into the light. It didn't follow. It just raised one thin arm, slowly, as if measuring the distance between us with its fingers. I haven't gone back to Allegheny since. But sometimes at night, when my house settles and the walls creak, I swear I hear that same soft clicking, counting out a rhythm that only I seem to recognize. The incident that changed the way I think about camping happened in the Sawtooth Range of Idaho, a place I had loved since childhood. I always thought of those mountains as clean, honest wilderness, the kind you could trust, the kind you could walk into and disappear from the world for a while. I went up there every summer, usually alone, usually without issue. But one trip carved itself so deeply into my mind that even now, years later, I feel my pulse spike whenever I think about unzipping a tent flap in the dark. I arrived early in the afternoon, the sun high enough to paint the peaks in bright gold. The lake I chose to camp beside was small and secluded, hidden behind dense pines. Only a faint, rugged trail hinted that others had ever found the place. The water was still, black in the deepest part, and the air smelled of sap and cold stone. Everything felt exactly how I liked it, silent, remote, unbothered. I set up camp near the shore, my tent angled, so I could see the water through its doorway. The forest around me stretched in every direction, thick and shadowed, but nothing about it felt threatening. Not yet. I spent the first couple hours wandering the shoreline, skipping stones, watching the rings spread across the lake. It was peaceful in a way I rarely experienced in my day-to-day life. I remember thinking I had chosen the perfect weekend to escape everything. Right around dusk, the first odd thing happened. I was crouched by the water, washing my hands, when I noticed small ripples forming in the middle of the lake. Not from fish, not from wind, just a single, gentle disturbance, like something broke the surface for a moment and then sank quietly again. I didn't see anything. No splash, no body, no movement. just expanding rings pushing through the fading reflection of the sky. I shrugged it off, assuming it was fish deeper under the surface. But later, when the sky turned purple and the mountains disappeared into silhouettes, I noticed the woods had become unnervingly quiet. Even in remote places, you expect some noise, birds settling, insects buzzing, the occasional rustle of branches. But all I heard was the faint lapping of the lake and the soft crackle of my fire. I kept glancing toward the treeline, feeling a tight pressure in my chest that had no obvious cause. I ate dinner by the fire and tried to shake the uneasiness. It worked for a while. The flames were comforting, and I told myself the silence was just nature switching shifts for the night. But when I walked to the water's edge to clean my pot, I noticed something that made every muscle in my body stiffen. On the shoreline were footprints. Not mine, not boot prints. Bare footprints, long, narrow, and unmistakably human, pressed deep into the damp sand. They trailed from the treeline toward the water, ending just before the lake swallowed them. I stared at them for a long time, cold adrenaline crawling up my spine. There should have been prints leading back into the woods, but there weren't. No returning steps. Just a line of footprints walking straight into the lake, as if someone had calmly entered the water and never come back out. I backed away slowly, scanning the tree line, the shoreline, the black surface of the lake. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. I told myself someone must have passed by earlier, maybe a swimmer or a hiker, though the prints were fresh and sharply defined, as though they had been made minutes earlier. When full darkness settled, I retreated to my tent, zipped it up, and tried to calm down. The fire flickered outside, casting an orange glow through the fabric. I lay down and listened to the lake, forcing myself to breathe slowly. Eventually I drifted into an uneasy sleep. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a sound that didn't belong in the woods. Dripping. A steady drip, 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 as if water was falling onto the ground just outside my tent. My eyes snapped open, and I held my breath, listening. The dripping continued, too close, too rhythmic, like someone standing over the tent roof was soaked and letting water slide off their body. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The sound grew heavier, each drop hitting the dirt with a wet thud. Then the dripping stopped abruptly, replaced by the soft sound of shifting sand near my tent door. Someone, or something, was stepping near the entrance. I could see the shadow through the tent fabric, a distorted shape cast by the dying fire. The silhouette was tall but slightly hunched, its posture strangely unnatural. It lingered there, unmoving, as though it were listening for something inside. I felt my heartbeat in my throat, loud enough that I was sure it could hear me. Then I heard breathing. Shallow, uneven breaths, too close, too wet-sounding, like lungs filled with fluid. The silhouette leaned closer until it eclipsed nearly all the faint firelight seeping into the tent. My hands trembled uncontrollably, and I pressed them flat against my sleeping bag to keep them from shaking the fabric. The breathing continued for several long, excruciating moments. Then it moved, slowly, methodically, circling the tent. I watched the shadow slide from one side to the other, its shape warping along the curved walls. Every few seconds it paused, as if checking something, then continued its path. At one point, I felt a faint vibration under me, like something pressed against the ground near my sleeping pad. The shadow lingered on the far side of the tent for what felt like an eternity, then slowly melted away into the darkness. I stayed awake until sunrise, frozen with dread. Only when the sky began to lighten did I step outside. What I found tightened a knot in my stomach that never truly went away. The bare footprints were back, but this time they surrounded my tent in a perfect ring. Each print pointed toward the fabric, toes angled inward, and water, cold lake water, was splattered across the ground, forming dark patches that led from the lake to the ring of footprints. Worst of all was the object I found beside the tent door. A single, wet handprint pressed onto the sand. Large, human, and fresh. I tore down my campsite in record time. I didn't look at the lake, didn't inspect the woods, didn't try to understand. I just left, practically running with my gear half-packed. I made it to my car breathless and shaking. Before driving off, I looked back once. Down by the shoreline, right where the footprints had disappeared into the water the night before, stood a lone figure. Tall, motionless, facing me. Its skin, or whatever covered its skin, gleamed like something still dripping. I floored the gas and didn't stop until the mountains were miles behind me. I haven't camped near a lake since, and sometimes when I shower or stand near water, I swear I hear that slow, steady dripping just behind me. I still don't know how long the man had been watching me before I noticed him. Sometimes I lie awake at night replaying the sounds I ignored, the instincts I brushed off, the unease I kept swallowing down. It happened in the Ozark National Forest in Arkansas, a place I'd always considered rugged but safe. I'd camped there plenty of times, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. That weekend was supposed to be a simple, peaceful solo trip. I had no reason to expect anything strange. No reason to believe someone else would be out there in the same stretch of woods, hidden just far enough back that I wouldn't see them until it was too late. I arrived early on a Friday afternoon and followed an unmarked trail that wound down into a deep hollow. The forest around me was dense, the kind that muffles sound and swallows light even on bright days. The air felt heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. When I reached a small clearing beside a narrow creek, I decided it was perfect. Remote, quiet, untouched. I set up my tent, filtered some water, and gathered wood for the evening fire. Nothing felt wrong at first, but the longer I stayed there, the more something in my chest tightened. It began as a subtle tension, like my body was reacting to something my eyes hadn't processed yet. I told myself it was just the isolation, the quiet, the long work week I had been desperate to escape. But as the sun dipped behind the ridgeline and the shadows stretched across the forest floor, the air took on a strange, charged feeling, like a storm was gathering somewhere just out of sight. I decided to walk along the creek before it got too dark. I followed it for a few hundred yards, listening to the trickle of water over stones. At one point, I knelt to take a picture of a moss-covered log, and that's when I felt it, eyes on my back. Not imagined, not vague. A precise, focused pressure, like a finger pressed directly between my shoulder blades. I stood up slowly and scanned the trees. Nothing moved. No sound. No figure ducking behind a trunk. The forest looked exactly as it had before. But my pulse hammered against my ribs, and for a moment I could hardly breathe. I convinced myself it was paranoia and walked back to camp, but every few seconds I glanced over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone. Still, the feeling didn't leave. If anything, it only sharpened. By the time I returned to the clearing, dusk had settled in hard. I built a fire, cooked a small meal, and tried to relax. The flames crackled and threw shifting shapes across the surrounding trees, but the light only made the darkness beyond them feel thicker. At one point, I heard something snap, a clean, deliberate sound, not the random breaking of a twig. I sat perfectly still, staring into the shadows, waiting for movement. Nothing came. The woods returned to silence, but the silence didn't feel natural anymore. When night fully took over, I climbed into my tent and zipped it shut. I left the fire burning low, its light flickering against the nylon. I lay on my back and tried to focus on the steady rhythm of the creek. For a while, I actually managed to relax. But then I heard footsteps. Not close at first. Just faint impressions in the leaf litter, maybe 30 or 40 yards away. Slow, deliberate steps. One at a time, with long pauses in between. Whoever it was didn't seem lost. They weren't calling out or stumbling. They weren't shining a flashlight. They were moving carefully, almost rhythmically, like they were pacing or tracing a path they already knew. The footsteps grew closer. Too close. My breath caught in my throat. The fire outside had died down to a dim glow, but there was just enough light for me to see the faintest shadow shift across the outer layer of the tent. The footsteps stopped. The forest went still again. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then I heard breathing. Not heavy. Not panicked. Slow. Steady. Controlled. Someone was standing just outside my tent, breathing so quietly, it was like they were trying not to be heard. My eyes burned from keeping them open so wide. My hands shook uncontrollably. I willed myself not to move, not even to swallow. The breathing continued, calm and patient, like whoever it was had all the time in the world. After a long, suffocating moment, the breathing stopped. But I didn't hear footsteps walking away. No shifting leaves. No branches brushing against clothes. Just nothing. The silence was worse. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, but in reality it was likely 15 or 20 minutes before I dared to move my hand toward my flashlight. I clicked it on and shone it around the tent, but the beam only illuminated fabric. No shadow. No movement. I forced myself to unzip the tent just a crack, enough to peer out. The fire was nearly dead, edges glowing faintly. The clearing was dim, shapes blurred in the darkness. I scanned the trees, the creek, the edge of the clearing. Nothing. But then my eyes caught something, two small, vertical scratches on a nearby tree trunk. about shoulder height. Fresh, exposed wood still pale against the bark. I hadn't noticed them before. I shone the flashlight around again and saw more scratches. On another tree, then another. They formed a rough semicircle around my campsite, each at about the same height, each recently made. They hadn't been there earlier. I would have seen them. Someone had marked the trees while I was inside the tent. I didn't sleep. I didn't even sit back down. I stood with my flashlight in hand until the sky turned gray and the birds finally began to stir. At first light, I packed everything. My hands shook so badly I kept fumbling with the tent poles. As I folded the tent, something on the ground caught my eye. A footprint. Human. Bare. Right beside where my head had been while I slept. The toes were pointed toward the tent wall. I felt sick, but there was something worse. The footprint wasn't alone. A faint trail led into the trees, following the line of the marked trunks. I didn't follow it. I didn't want to know where it led. As I slung my pack over my shoulder and turned toward the trail out of the hollow, I caught movement in the trees far across the creek. A figure half hidden just standing there. Not moving. Not approaching. Watching. I didn't wait to see if he stepped closer. I hiked out faster than I ever have in my life, not looking back until I reached my truck. When I finally did turn, the forest looked utterly normal. Quiet. Innocent. As if it had swallowed every trace of what happened. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that patient breathing just outside the fabric of my tent, waiting for me to fall asleep. There are nights when I still wake up convinced I can smell that place again. Damp pine, cold stone, and something metallic that didn't belong in the woods. The memory takes me straight back to northern Georgia, to a small, unofficial campsite along the edge of the Chattahoochee National Forest. I went there in late autumn, when the air was already brittle with cold and the trees had shed most of their leaves. I expected quiet, maybe even loneliness. What I didn't expect was the feeling that someone else had claimed that patch of forest long before I arrived, and wasn't happy about the intrusion. I reached the site late in the afternoon. The sky was a pale gray, the kind that makes daylight feel thinner. The forest floor was layered with dead leaves that crunched under every step, broadcasting my presence whether I liked it or not. I set my tent beside an old fire ring made of stacked stones. It looked like it had been used recently, though there was no fresh ash inside, just a few charred fragments of burned wood. Something about that bothered me, but I shrugged it off. After setting up camp, I walked a short distance into the trees to find a good place to hang my food bag. That was when I noticed the first thing that didn't fit. A rope. A long, weathered rope tied between two trees at eye level, the fibers frayed and dark with age. It stretched across the trees like some forgotten clothesline, sagging slightly in the middle. There were no hooks, no remnants of fabric, nothing to suggest it had ever been for drying clothes or gear. It just hung there quietly, as if waiting for some purpose I didn't understand. I stepped around it, uneasy but curious. About 20 yards farther, I found another rope, then a third, all tied at the same height, all stretched between pairs of trees, creating rough, disconnected lines in the woods. I remember standing there, the hairs rising at the back of my neck, thinking it looked like someone had started building something but abandoned it halfway. A boundary? A warning? The ropes had no obvious pattern, but they were unmistakably deliberate. The forest suddenly felt tighter, like the space around me had shrunk. I went back to camp quickly, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than a weird backwoods project someone left behind. The sun dipped early behind the hills, pulling darkness into the forest faster than I expected. I made a fire, cooked dinner, and tried reading a book to distract myself. But every few minutes, I glanced toward the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Not even insects. It was as if the forest itself were holding its breath. When night fully settled in, I crawled into my tent. The fabric rippled with the faint breeze, and the fire outside cast an orange glow that pulsed softly across the ground. For a while, I managed to relax. Exhaustion dragged me toward sleep. I woke to the sound of something snapping. A sharp, clean sound, too close to ignore. Not a twig under an animal's paw. Not a tree limb falling. Something more precise. Like tension giving way. Then another snap. Then another. I sat upright, heart pounding. The snaps were rhythmic, spaced far enough apart that I could hear each one clearly through the tent walls. The fire outside had nearly died, and shadows flickered along the fabric with every shift of the dying embers. Snap. I realized what the sound was. Rope. Someone, or something, was pulling on one of the ropes I'd seen earlier. Pulling hard enough to tighten it, strain it, and then let it snap back into place. Snap. The sound echoed through the trees, closer this time. Too close. I held perfectly still, barely breathing. The snapping stopped for a few seconds, replaced by the faintest rustle of leaves. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Moving closer. I reached for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, something brushed against the outer wall of my tent. A soft, dragging motion like fingers trailing across the fabric. The pressure was light, but unmistakable. My chest seized with panic. The dragging stopped at the front of the tent. I watched the shadow shift as something blocked the faint fire glow. A shape leaned forward. Tall. Thin. Unmoving. My heartbeat felt like it filled the entire tent. Then, without warning, a sudden, violent snap tore through the woods, loud, sharp, aggressive. Not from tension. From force. The sound of a rope being ripped clean off whatever held it. Something heavy toppled nearby, hitting the ground hard enough that I felt the impact through the earth beneath me. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The forest went silent again. Minutes stretched like hours. At some point, I realized I was clenching my jaw so hard it hurt. The shadow outside the tent stayed there, motionless. Watching. Waiting. Eventually it moved. Slowly. Carefully. I listened to the soft crush of leaves as it stepped away from the tent and into the forest. I tracked the footsteps by sound alone. And then something strange happened. The footsteps didn't fade. They multiplied. One set became two. Then three. Then more. All moving carefully, deliberately, weaving through the trees at a pace that felt coordinated. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them, like a group silently surrounding the clearing. The snapping started again. This time all around me. Ropes tightening, straining, breaking. Echoing through the hollow like distant gunshots. Something moved fast between the trees, circling the campsite, pulling, testing, breaking. It felt like they were dismantling something, taking back control of whatever pattern those ropes had once formed. I stayed frozen until the snapping finally stopped. And then the breathing began. Not from one direction, from several points around the tent. Slow, even, close. It felt like a ring tightening around me. I don't know how long I stayed awake, muscles locked, waiting for something to cut through the tent or step into the clearing. But nothing more happened. The breathing faded. The footsteps retreated. The forest reclaimed its silence. When dawn came, it came slowly, painfully, like the world was reluctant to lift whatever had settled over the night. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. Ropes were everywhere, but not hanging. They were laid across the ground in long, straight lines. Dozens of them, all pointing toward my tent like spokes on a wheel. And every rope had been cut cleanly, ends frayed outward as if torn from the trees with precise, intentional force. At the center of those lines sat the old fire ring, except now, the stones had been rearranged into an almost perfect circle. A boundary, or maybe a message. I didn't take time to think about it. I packed up and left in minutes, practically stumbling over the ropes as I fled. As I reached the trailhead and turned back one last time, I saw movement deep in the trees. Not one figure. Several. Standing apart. Motionless. Watching me leave. I drove away and never returned to that stretch of forest. But sometimes, especially on cold nights, I still hear the echo of ropes snapping in the dark, like something reminding me I was never supposed to be there in the first place. I still think about the sound that woke me that night, the faint metallic tap that didn't belong anywhere in the woods of northern Arizona. It wasn't loud, not even enough to make the wind pause in the pines, but it was sharp and deliberate, like someone flicking a nail against a piece of metal. At first I thought it came from inside my dream, but when I opened my eyes, the darkness inside the tent felt too alert and too real for it to be part of sleep. I remember lying perfectly still, listening, waiting for it to happen again, because deep down I knew it would. I had gone out there alone for the first time since my divorce was finalized. I told myself I needed the isolation, the silence, the sense of being untethered from everything familiar. My coworkers said it wasn't smart to camp alone, but I shrugged it off. I chose a remote primitive site 8 miles off a Forest Service road near the Mogollon Rim. The kind of place where the trees grow thick and the ground stays cool even at midday. The kind of place where you can go a whole weekend without seeing another person. That was exactly what I wanted. During the day the forest felt gentle, even welcoming. I set up camp, walked a few miles, watched the light shift between the branches, listened to the kind of silence you only find far from people. But as dusk came, something in the air changed. I felt it before I understood it. A heaviness, a pressure, like the woods were inhaling and refusing to exhale. I told myself it was just nighttime settling in, the temperature dropping, my mind adjusting. Still, I kept glancing toward the tree line without knowing why. When the metallic tap woke me, I lay rigid, breath shallow. The sound had come from the direction of my truck. I knew the angle of it immediately. The truck was parked about 30 feet from the tent, just beyond the reach of my lantern's glow. I imagined someone standing there, touching something lightly, testing the presence of a stranger. I waited for the sound again, counting each second like it was stretching. When it finally came, a second tap, I felt it in my teeth. I forced myself to unzip the sleeping bag slowly. I didn't want anything outside to hear sudden movement. My hands were unsteady as I reached for the small flashlight I kept near my boots. I pressed the switch, but I covered the beam with my palm, so only a faint glow leaked between my fingers. The tent fabric looked so thin then, like a sheet barely separating me from whatever waited beyond it. The wind moved. A dry scrape of pine needles brushed against the ground. Then a faint crunch, too deliberate, too heavy to be an animal that size. I felt my pulse slam in my neck. I considered calling out, asking if someone was there, but something in my body resisted the idea violently. I had the overwhelming sense that if I acknowledged it, whatever stood near my truck would turn its attention fully toward me. So I stayed silent. Minutes passed with no more taps, no more steps. Just the suffocating stillness of night pressing against the tent. Eventually, slowly, I drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. The next morning the campsite looked untouched. My truck doors were locked. My gear was exactly where I'd left it. Nothing looked disturbed except for a thin smear of dust on the driver's side window, like a fingertip had been dragged across it. I tried to convince myself it had been there before I arrived. I even wiped it away with my sleeve to make myself feel better. But deep down I knew someone had touched my truck during the night. Despite everything, I convinced myself to stay for the second night. I told myself fear shouldn't dictate my life anymore. I didn't want to be the kind of person who fled from shadows. But even as the sun dipped behind the pines that evening, I felt a familiar tension gripping my stomach. I tightened the guy lines on the tent. I checked the locks on the truck twice. I ate dinner quickly, barely tasting it. By the time I crawled into the tent for the night, the forest had gone eerily quiet. Too quiet. No insects. No distant owls. Just the wind occasionally brushing through the branches like something searching for a way inside. I lay there for almost an hour, listening, waiting for any sound that didn't belong. When the first tap came, I felt cold all over. This time it wasn't against the truck. It was against one of my metal tent stakes. A sharp, chilling ring that vibrated through the ground. I sat up so fast the air inside the tent shifted. The beam of my flashlight trembled across the fabric as I aimed it toward the corner where the sound had come from. Another tap followed, slower, lighter, as if someone was dragging a metal object along the stake. The realization hit me with suffocating clarity. Whatever had been at my truck the night before had moved closer. Much closer. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I felt the weight of whoever stood outside, hovering right at the edge of the tent. The nylon shifted slightly inward like a fingertip or a knuckle pressed against it. Not pushing hard, just testing the shape of me through the fabric. My throat tightened so painfully I nearly gagged. The tapping stopped, but something else replaced it. A slow exhale, barely audible, almost lost to the wind. Except there was no wind at that moment. I knew because I could hear every heartbeat pulsing in my ears. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I couldn't tell. The presence outside didn't move away. It just stayed there, a silent weight in the darkness, as if deciding something. I knew I couldn't wait until morning. Whatever was outside wanted something from me, and I didn't want to find out what. When I finally moved, it was with desperate precision. I grabbed the flashlight, unzipped the tent with a single fast motion, and burst out into the night. The beam hit nothing. No figure. No footprints. No broken branches. My truck sat still and silent, reflecting the narrow glare of the flashlight. The woods around me were empty, but the tent stake that had been tapped was bent at a slight angle, like someone had gripped it and twisted it. I didn't pack up carefully. I shoved everything into the truck in frantic handfuls. I kept the flashlight in my mouth the whole time, shaking uncontrollably. When I finally slammed the door shut and locked it from the inside, I felt a moment of safety. But it didn't last, because as I backed up, the headlights swept across the trees, and for a fraction of a second, I saw something standing between two pines. A person, completely still, completely silent, watching me. The face wasn't clear. The body didn't move, but the posture told me everything. They had been waiting for me to leave the tent. They had been waiting for me to step into the open. And the worst part is that when my headlights passed over that spot again as I turned onto the dirt road, the figure was gone. I haven't gone camping alone since. But sometimes, when I park my truck at night, I still find a thin smear on the window, like someone dragging a fingertip across the glass just to let me know they remember exactly where I am. I think the moment I truly understood how easily a person can disappear was the morning I found the boot print beside my tent. One single print in the soft dirt, facing toward the door flap, like someone had been standing there for a long time just watching me through the thin nylon while I slept. It wasn't deep enough to show weight shifting or movement, and that still bothers me. It looked like someone had stepped down gently, quietly, placing the boot as carefully as possible to avoid waking me. The restraint in that single print haunts me more than any scream or violent struggle could have. I had chosen a quiet campground in southern Colorado, not far from the New Mexico border. It wasn't remote enough to be truly isolated, but remote enough for the nights to feel heavier than they should. A small, seasonal campground tucked in a patch of ponderosa pines, with only 4 total sites and no host after early October. When I arrived, I was the only one there. The air smelled like sap and cold earth, and something about it felt right. I'd been planning a solo weekend for months, desperate for something that made me feel grounded again. My life had become an exhausting loop of long work days and restless nights, and all I wanted was a couple days of quiet and fresh air. The first night passed without incident. I read by lantern light until the insects grew quiet, then crawled into my sleeping bag and drifted into an easy sleep. The forest settled around me like a blanket. Nothing strange, nothing unnerving. Just a peaceful October night with the wind threading its way through the trees. The next morning, the boot print waited for me. I stared at it for almost 30 seconds before my brain even processed what I was looking at. A heavy-soled hiking boot, much larger than mine, angled perfectly toward the tent. No other prints around it, no impressions leading away. Just the single deliberate mark of someone who had come close, too close, and stood there long enough for the weight to sink into the dirt. My chest tightened with the cold, creeping realization that I had slept through someone approaching my tent. The idea made my skin crawl. I half convinced myself it belonged to a hunter who wandered in by mistake or someone passing through the area. But even then, why stop inches from my tent? Why stand there? Why leave no other prints? I didn't pack up. Not yet. A part of me refused to let fear ruin the one trip I'd promised myself. I walked the area, scanning for more tracks, more signs, anything to make sense of it. But the forest floor was stubborn. Hard in some places, covered in dry needles in others. The single print remained the only sign anyone had been there. By midday, clouds rolled in thick and low. The forecast hadn't mentioned a storm, but the air shifted in that quiet, electric way that warns you something is building. I gathered more firewood, tightened the stand lines of my tent, and tried to settle. The woods felt different that afternoon, hollow, watchful. I kept glancing up from whatever I was doing, convinced someone or something was standing just out of sight behind the trees. When dusk came, it came fast. The color drained from the world, and the campground dimmed into a dull wash of gray. I sat by the fire, trying to eat, but every crackle in the undergrowth turned my head. The trees creaked softly as the wind shifted. A feeling settled into my spine like pins, something between dread and certainty. I wasn't alone out there. I left the fire burning longer than usual, letting the glow spill into the surrounding woods. I told myself it helped keep animals away, but the truth was I needed it. The darkness pressed in too close. My tent looked foreign, almost flimsy. When I finally forced myself to crawl inside for the night, I zipped it quickly, almost too quickly, like something could slip in if I hesitated. For a long time, nothing happened. The storm stayed distant, rumbling far beyond the ridgeline. The wind pushed the tent fabric softly, rising and falling in gentle breaths. I tried to sleep, but my heart wouldn't slow. My mind kept returning to that single boot print. It was near midnight when I heard the first sound. A slow, rhythmic crunch. Footsteps. Not rushed. Not cautious. Just steady and unhurried, approaching from the tree line behind my tent. My whole body stiffened. I pushed myself upright, careful not to make the air inside shift. The footsteps stopped just a few feet behind me. The fabric of the tent reverberated with the faint vibration of breath, slow, steady, too close. I covered my mouth with both hands, terrified the sound of my breathing would give me away, even though they already knew exactly where I was. Seconds passed. The presence didn't move. It didn't speak. It didn't attempt to open the tent. It just stood there, listening. I felt air moving gently along the fabric near my shoulder, as if someone was leaning forward, pressing their face almost against mine with only the thin nylon separating us. The sensation was so visceral, I had to clamp my teeth together to keep from making a noise. A faint scrape followed. Something dragged lightly across the back of the tent, 2 fingertips tracing a slow, deliberate arc from one side to the other. The pressure was light, almost curious. Then it stopped. I didn't move for almost 20 minutes. Not a breath. Not a twitch. My muscles shook with tension. Every second stretched impossibly long. When the sky outside finally flashed with distant lightning, the shape behind the tent shifted. 2 slow steps backward, then nothing. Not the sound of retreating footsteps. Not the sound of someone walking away. Just absence, like the person had been swallowed whole by the dark. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent with hands that barely worked. I expected to find new footprints. A trail. Anything. But the ground was undisturbed. Not a single track behind the tent. No marks leading into the trees. Nothing but the flattened patches where the storm's wind had pressed down loose needles. But the boot print from the day before remained. I packed everything in less than 10 minutes, shoving gear into the car without care. The feeling of being watched grew unbearable, like eyes followed every move I made. Just as I slammed the car door shut, a gust of wind pushed loose dust across the ground, and for a moment, I saw something faint beneath it. A second boot print. Not beside the tent, not near the fire ring, but directly behind my car, facing the driver's door. I stared at it through the windshield, heart hammering, realizing someone had stood there while I slept the first night, close enough to reach for the door handle if they wanted to. I didn't stay long enough to brush the dirt off and look for more. I drove. Fast. The forest blurred past me, the trees thinning only when I hit the main road. My hands shook the entire 2-hour drive to the nearest town. I still don't know who was out there with me. I don't know how they moved without leaving tracks. I don't know why they only watched, never touched, never spoke. But sometimes, when I park my car at night, I think about the second boot print. The one facing my door. The one that meant whoever stood there wasn't just watching me. They were waiting for me.